Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Purpose Up podcast. Today, I am very excited to have with me Michael O'Brien. Welcome, Michael.
Hey Ben, how you doing?
I am doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. It's a beautiful day, a little cold, but still the sun's out, so I will take that.
Awesome, awesome. So you are a business consultant, coach, author, accident survivor. Tell us a little bit about your first about what you do, and then we'll go a little bit into your story.
Yeah, no problem. Also, we'll add in liver, just like life enthusiast. Just I love living life and maximizing every day. So what I do now is I help leaders, how I like to say, become the wealthiest person they know, but starting from the inside out. So I know a whole bunch of people, I know you do too, that have a lot of external wealth. They have the job, they have the car, they have the house, they have the career, but not necessarily the peace and happiness within, the fulfillment, the joy within. So I work with them on trying to create great leadership change that they want to create at work, but also working on their inner health, their inner wealth. So I do that, and I also go into companies and share my story that I know we'll get into. And then I also have a leadership academy for all the emerging leaders out there that are not going to get a corporate sponsored coach, but they're so thirsty to get better. I help them do just that in a way that's not like your typical corporate workshop.
Awesome, awesome. Well, we'll put a pin in that Leadership Academy later, amongst the other things. And so we alluded to your accident. Let's talk about what happened and how that changed everything.
Well, I affectionately call it my last bad day. It's July 11th, 2001. And I was out in New Mexico. So I live in New Jersey. That's where I was living at the time of the accident. And I had a typical corporate workshop, right? Fly out on Monday, fly back on Friday. And in between, they were going to try to torture us with PowerPoint and maybe some team building activities. And I have this bucket list thing where I still have it, ride my bike in every state of this country. And I had to cross New Mexico off my list. So I thought it was perfect. I'm like, all right, I'm going to cross New Mexico off the list. I'll bring my bike out. I'll get some outside vitamin D, avoid the hotel gym. And I came up with this great little loop. It was a 2-mile loop out the back of the hotel, up the main drag, about 2 miles. Thought I'd do about 10 laps, get 20 miles in, shower up, and head to the meeting. And on that morning of July 11th, 2001, I came around the bend on the 4th lap, and a Ford Explorer was heading right towards me. It crossed totally into my lane. It was so surreal, Ben. I couldn't react fast enough. I really thought, like, I was watching him come closer and closer and closer. And I thought, surely he's going to swerve to avoid me. Like, what is he doing? Like, it wasn't computing at all. And I just ran out of time, ran out of asphalt, if you will. And I remember the sound of me hitting his grill. Into the windshield I went. Remember that sound, the screech of his brakes. And then the thud I made as I came to the asphalt below. And of course, all that knocked me unconscious. And then when I finally regained consciousness, when the EMTs arrived, I was really disoriented, like feeling all intense pain, the worst pain I've ever felt in my life. And I remember asking the EMTs, only a question another cyclist can truly appreciate. I was like, hey, how's my bike? And because that's what cyclists do. Like when we crash, we're not really worried about our bodies. We're worried about our bicycles, which doesn't really, make any sense at all, but that's what we do. And they looked at me and I think they just shook their head and were like, yeah, your bike's fine, sir. And so at the time, I didn't have any identification on me whatsoever. And I was having one hell of a time trying to share my name and number, and I kept on getting it wrong. And they knew I was staying at the hotel, but for the longest time, until my wife came out to ID me, I was known as Trauma Patient Mango. So we have this like weird thing in our family with mangoes, and I'm not a super big mango lover, except for like maybe a really good mango margarita. That's the only thing I'll down when it comes to mangoes. Yeah.
Okay, so did they name you Mango because you were talking about mangoes, or is that
No,
a coincidence?
no. So it's just like hurricanes, right? They go down the alphabet.
Gotcha.
They just got to M in terms of like trauma victims without identification. And how it's just, I became Mango. And so early in the hospital, like, people started sending me mangoes. And so it's just stuck.
Oh, so now
Uh,
now it's become the thing.
it's a thing, like we have a painting in our house of mangoes. And I'm like, I really don't like mangoes at all, but it's just one of those things. It's now part of our little folklore in our house, so it's pretty cool.
All right, all right. And I can't imagine that sort of trauma. The only thing that I can identify with is a much more minor bicycle accident that I had on the West Side Highway, where I went over the handlebars and broke my wrist. And I remember the sound of my wrist breaking because I actually thought it was my sunglasses, but my sunglasses were fine. But I can't imagine something that hardcore and waking up in the hospital. That must have been. Did you have your wits about you once you got back in the hospital, or was there still like brain stuff going on?
Well, there's definitely, like, I had obviously a major concussion. So, and the concussion I had really left me very fatigued. So, like, at the accident scene, all I remember, Ben, was like willing myself not to fall asleep.
Right.
So, because I really felt like once I regained consciousness, if I fell asleep again or passed out, if you will, I may never wake up again. So I kept on telling myself, hey, whatever you do, stay awake, stay awake. I remember getting on the helicopter. It was a 19-minute flight to the rooftop at the University of New Mexico at Albuquerque. I remember every one of those 19 minutes. And that's sort of when I made a commitment that I would stop chasing happiness. I would live life a lot different. And then I came down the elevator shaft into the trauma center. For those listeners that might remember the show ER, I felt like I was like in a scene of ER. There were like 20 people in the trauma room. I met my anesthesiologist, and then I don't remember anything for the next 4 days.
Good
So
anesthesiologist.
yeah, very good. So first surgery lasted about 10 to 12 hours. I needed 34 units of blood product because what happened by breaking a whole bunch of everything, but really the big injury was I shattered my left femur. And when that femur bone shattered, it lacerated the femoral artery. So the doctors told my wife, had I been 10 years older or not in shape at the time, I certainly would have passed away before I even got to the hospital. And so I spent the next 4 days and change in the ICU, and they brought me out of the ICU in the middle of the night. So I'm out in the ICU, I'm still a little groggy, and then I regain sort of my alertness in the middle of the night. So here I am. I really don't know where I am. I wake up, my right leg is still in traction. I'm all alone. And I was scared the living daylights out of me. I was like, what's going on? I immediately called the nurse. I wanted some type of explanation. And then we sort of, that was sort of the beginning, right? That was the Baltic Avenue of the Monopoly board of my recovery.
Nice.
Yeah.
And question, do you have Boardwalk and Park Place now, or is that still in
Let's
progress?
see. So dude, so that's like getting to mastery, right? Self mastery, craft mastery. So I'm on my way to getting Boardwalk and Park Place.
So you're
So
in the
I
yellow
might,
or greens right now?
yeah. So I think, I'm sort of like the yellow, like the waterworks, right? So I've passed, I've gone past free parking, right? I've gone past, go directly to jail. I'm turning the corner into North Carolina Avenue and those things. At least that's the way I like to think.
Um, so you mentioned this a little bit earlier, and I think it's a great place to kind of dive in a little bit deeper as we talk about mindset, because I know that's a huge thing for your consulting and a huge thing that has kind of helped you realize how to be happier. Can you talk about the notion of do, have, be, and its corollary, which you find is much more conducive to being fulfilled?
Sure. Well, I'll give the whole do, have, be type of approach to Zig Ziglar. So this goes back a number of years, but when I was younger and I was starting my corporate sales career, I would listen to Zig Ziglar cassette tapes. So I'm now totally dating myself to your listeners, but I listened to Zig and all his wisdom and his Southern charm with his Southern accent. And he talked about how so many people, and I think it's even more pervasive nowadays, they live a life where it's do, have, be, meaning like do sort of the hustle and grind to have a whole bunch of stuff, material possessions, whatnot, titles, money, you name it. And then you'll be whatever you want to be, happy, a leader, successful. And I was living my life that way, even though, hey, I was listening to his tapes, but I was living life a little bit different. I almost felt like I was a hamster on the hamster wheel, just doing a lot, right? Not being intentional. Back at the time of my accident, this was before really the internet and social media in 2001, like before Facebook, before LinkedIn, before a lot of what we know today in terms of meditation and vulnerability and intentionality. Like we didn't have necessarily the type of resources back then as we do today. So I was just sort of doing what I thought society wanted me to do, trying to go after the have. I did suffer from some comparisonitis, comparing what I had versus like my neighbor or my colleague or, my boss or what have you. And I would tell myself that, hey, once I get promoted or once I buy that new car, or maybe once this meeting is over, things will get better and I'll be happy. And sometimes my wife would call my bluff and say, every time you talk about the next meeting and how busy you are, it never really gets any easier. Like it might be easy for a day, but then the next meeting comes, you got to plan for that one. So it's never going to it's never going to slow down.
Right.
So
I've heard someone else talk about that as forget the TED Talk to attribute it, but it's like destination addiction,
yeah,
where it's like you're just hooked on getting the next thing versus being where you are.
absolutely. So the whole idea of being present, back then I was like, what's that? That's like, it's like, we got to go, we got to make it, we got to make things happen. So yeah, that destination, addiction, or obsession, definitely that was part of it. Through my recovery, so the reason why I could call it my last bad day is I realized that everything in life is neutral until we label it, or in other words, nothing has meaning until we give it meaning.
Right.
And the early part of my recovery, the narrative I had was like, I'm a victim. Like I had what the doctors told me, I had a lifetime of dependencies and limitations and more surgeries, and my life was turned upside down. They were sort of questioning whether or not I'd be able to walk properly again. Forget about riding your bike. Forget about being really functional the way I thought I was functional in the past. And so this victim story really took hold. And then I realized, well, you know what? I have some choice in this matter. I have some agency. I don't have to follow this victim narrative. I can label this accident completely different. I don't have to label it as a bad thing. This is really an opportunity to showcase resilience. And with that, I started changing my self narrative. And then I flipped that script, that whole do, have, be, do, have, meaning that I was going to show up being grateful, as an example, doing the things that grateful people do, right? Trying to shift your perspective to the things that you do have and you can still do, all that jazz. And then as a result, you actually have more gratitude in your life, or more happiness, or more success. And that was a monumental shift in perspective just on how I wanted to live my life. So I started developing new practices to help me do that, like setting my intentions or priorities in the morning, my mindfulness or meditation practice, gratitude in the evening, but trying to pay more attention, just being present to how I was showing up during the course of the day.
Awesome.
And I really do think that without my accident, which in some ways I label it as one massive pause button to say, hey, like, let's just, check yourself, right? The whole check yourself before you wreck yourself, to quote the poet Ice Cube. That it really gave me a chance to come back to my corporate job on my own terms. And if the accident didn't happen, I really don't think I get to the executive suite at my company. And I don't think I come up with, Peloton coaching as it is today without it.
Amazing. Amazing. I love, there's a lot to unpack in what you just said, but I want to go back to the realization for a moment when when that light switch happened. Was somebody like slapping you saying, hey, you need to change your mentality about this? Was this like an aha from old Zig Ziglar coming in? How did the epiphany occur? Or was it just like it kind of happened and then you're like,
Well, I think life happens like drip by drip, or I'll use a little cycling metaphor because I'm filled with cycling metaphors and I could probably bore your listeners with cycling metaphors. But
hey, they're along for the ride. It's okay.
yeah, so, okay, so that's another good one, right? So, but I think life happens and change happens drip by drip or pedal stroke by pedal stroke, right? So I think we make a big deal about like this big aha, right? The clouds part, rainbows come out, unicorns dance around, and there's an endless supply of Skittles. But I think there is a whole bunch of like micro moments before the big moment. So as I went through, like, say, my last bad day on July 11th, I had little mini moments, I think, leading up to that big moment where I was at a physical rehabilitation session. They sent me to Kessler's Institute for Rehab, where they took Christopher Reeves, to me, the original Superman, when he had his equestrian accident. And I took a break during my morning routine, and I looked around the room and I saw some people getting better and other people not. And for me, that like glance around the room was just again enough of a pause to realize, like, hey, you ain't putting all what you can into your recovery. And certainly you're not, your mindset isn't, full gas in terms of putting what you need to do to recover. When you get out of the hospital, get back up on your feet and really become the person you want to become. Like, I lost all the comparison stuff. I really just wanted to become, from a purpose perspective, the best husband, father, leader, and person I could be. And I let go of all the other stuff. But I realized, like, if I was going to do that, if that was going to be my purpose, then I had to shift my mindset. I had to start thinking differently if I wanted my body to heal in the way that I wanted it to heal.
Awesome. Yeah. So what that sounds like to me and what I'm hearing you say is like you switched from kind of the old you that was driven by external validation to the new you that became vision driven and away from a victim mentality to like just being totally responsible for what you were going to create.
Absolutely. It just became, and I think there's a lot of, one could look at of all the different moments and lessons I've learned up until that moment. And then I had a chance to harvest or to recruit those and say, okay, now's my opportunity to live life differently and to be a true owner of my life, right? So I'm responsible for it. I'm accountable for it. And this is how I'm going to choose to live my life going forward. And that doesn't mean like I haven't had some bad moments. Like the very next day after my big aha was a very challenging day where I started off with my routine. I was all eager. The morning was going great. And then I went off to an orthopedic surgeon follow-up visit. And I was really hoping for good news. I was hoping he was going to give me clearance to get back up on my legs again, because some of my rehab was limited because I couldn't bear weight on my legs because they were so badly broken. And he gave us really bad news. And it was so easy in that moment, Ben, for me to go back to the victim story. And I had to work on, hey, remembering that I have agency in this, I have choice. I'm going to still choose to be resilient. And that's the story I wanted to stick with. And those moments are hard. That's the emotional labor that I think makes such a big difference in really creating the success that we want to create in our lives.
Yes. And um, one of the things I was actually talking to a coach about recently was that vision doesn't really care about emotions. And that doesn't mean that you don't have them, but that you don't let them have power over you. But you get to use them as signals and input, but they're you're going to have good days and bad days, but you still keep tracking towards your vision to get what you want.
Absolutely. And I again, to that point, my aha wasn't a light switch, and it's certainly my success hasn't been linear. I've had moments where I've gone up, and I've had moments where it's gone down like a roller coaster, but then back up again, and it's looped and twisted and turned, and all that. So I, throughout my whole journey, I had some pretty dark moments. Never a bad day, but certainly dark moments where I had major setbacks in my health because of an infection after a surgery. And it was, it was going back to some of the things I learned earlier in the recovery to help me get through those moments, to keep on going, to sort of, if you will, keep pedaling.
Yes. So I had this question before we got started, and I want to ask it because I think it's important. Is like for those of us that don't have the opportunity to get bulldozed by an explorer, or sometimes it's often a loved one close to somebody dying that provides that wake up call. How do we get people to become awake to this? Taking responsibility to this this presence and this being and this gratitude without these life shattering moments.
So I love this question, and I get asked this a lot because people come up to me and say, "Well, hey, I don't have my like last bad day getting smacked by an SUV story, so how am I supposed to change?" And what I share with folks, and I'll share today, is that I had many micro signs that I probably should have paid attention to before that morning on July 11th, where I knew my life was misaligned ever so slightly. And I was so busy doing, I wasn't present. I really had a lack of awareness, and I just blew past them because I was like, hey, I'm too busy getting stuff done. And so, and then another sign came up, and I'd blow past that because I was busy hustling and grinding it, right, as we talk about today. But back then it was just like working hard, right? And I would blow past all these signs, and then finally, call it the universe or call it whatever, said, hey, you know what, Michael, you ain't getting the message. We got to send you a more powerful message. And the more powerful message was that SUV. But had I been more aware earlier in my life, as I was beginning my career, if you will, I would have been able to see these signs and make some adjustments faster. The thing about it, Ben, is that we often wait too late to make change happen in our lives, whether it's personal or corporate. From a personal level, we can
Well,
talk
Michael,
about,
it's not the right time. I've got so
yeah,
much going on. I
yeah.
mean,
Like we take something simple as weight loss, right? So, we're like, oh yeah, pound here, pound there, not a big deal.
I can do it next week
We
because
can do
this
it
week.
next week. And then all of a sudden, like that 1 to 2 pounds, like every month or two, turns out to be 15. And now we feel like we have to do something radical in order to get to a healthier weight. Or corporate change, we see all the signs, but we're like, well, we'll do it later, right? And we kick the can down the road, and then all of a sudden the corporation has to make one major transformation. So I get really nervous when I hear companies and people talk a lot about, I'm going to transform. Like that's like radical change. And that's one way of changing, but don't get me wrong. Sometimes change does happen in a lightning bolt type of scenario. But I'd rather have people become much more aware, more present to what's happening in their lives so they can make change drip by drip, pedal stroke by pedal stroke, in a less violent way. And so like the sort of the micro steps towards craft mastery, self-mastery, or however we want to describe it.
Yep. Yeah. James Clear, in his new book, Atomic Habits, talks about like just getting that 1% better each day to kind of make it a lot more sustainable, which is what you're alluding to.
Totally. And so actually James's book is one of the books we profiled in our Leadership Academy when we started talking about habits, but it's what I used back in my recovery. After I had my big aha, I made a determination that each day I'm going to just put in all the effort today to make tomorrow better. And one metric that we had was when I went into a rehab session, they had to measure my flexion, like how far my knees would bend. Like, could I bring my heel to my butt, right? And so they would put me down on my belly, and a therapist would get in back of me and crank on my legs to try to bring it, closer to my butt to get the range of motion so I could be functional again. And so going into those sessions, and they were painful, I had to pre-medicate with pain meds. I was just looking for 1 degree of flexion each day because I knew if I could put 7 days of 1 degree of movement, then I had 7 degrees of flexion improvement over a week. put a three or 4 weeks together, then I'm getting to the functionality that I need, not only to get back to life and my career, but actually get back on the bike. So I've taken that mentality, James's mentality of 1% better each day, all in an effort to create better tomorrows. And I think that's a better way of creating change at work, in your career, in life, than say the violent, seismic, we have to transform Hollywood voiceover type of approach to it.
Right. A kind of fast forward hero's journey.
Yes, absolutely.
What's when you're working with individuals in leadership or companies, what is the biggest kind of the most challenging piece of resistance to work through, and then what are the biggest ahas on the other side of that once people break through it?
Well, I think one big challenge today for a lot of leaders is anxiety. We talk about in our society a lot of loneliness, and that gets tied into sort of depression and worry and anxiety. But a lot of leaders that I work with have anxiety, just the anxiety about the future, which is worry about the future, like what's going to be next, what's going to happen, what should I do? And some of the best testimonials I get is when they call me, when I have a session, and they'll say, hey, you know what, my wife, my husband wants to thank you. And I'm like, okay, what do you mean by that? Well, I'm less anxious at home. I'm more present with my kids. I'm more present with my spouse or my partner. And so because life and work careers are so complex today, there's so much coming at today's leaders. There's so much to worry about if we choose to worry about it all. And I think it's just our, fertile soil for a lot of anxiety, which then triggers that voice in our head. The thing is that we all have like an inner critic or gremlin, the lizard brain, if you will, quoting Seth Godin, that gets in our way of us really stepping into our full potential. And so the leaders, even the ones at a very high level, VP, the C-suite, they have their own version of their inner voice, their self-narrative that holds them back. And then we have a tendency to, do some not so productive leadership behavior when we're in that fight and flight type of reaction. If we tend to be more directive, just at rest, we get more command and control under stress. And so how do we manage our stress triggers so we can move past those quickly and really connect with people in the way that we need to? Because ultimately that's what leadership is all about. You want a purpose, you want a compelling version of the future, but you want to connect with others and make it about their success. Under stress, if we're really triggered, it's hard to do that. It's hard to think outside of ourselves and about others. So we work on anxiety, we work on mindset, and we work on just dealing with the complexities and the priorities that any business has to handle during the course of a given day, a given week.
Gotcha. How does one work on, or what's your method for working on self-limiting beliefs? When you've got that executive that's like, oh, maybe I've got imposter syndrome, or maybe I'm not the right person for this job. I remember I had a story in my head in my last corporate job. I'm not strategic enough for this. How do you work through those stories that are in people's heads?
Well, so I love the strategic thing, right? So that gets played a lot. Like, you got to be more strategic, and we're all walking around with different definitions of what strategy is, and strategy really just comes down to choices, right? So can you make the proper choice? So for me, what I try to do, and this is a page out of sports, right? So you listen to athletes, whether on the basketball court, on the pitch, down the slopes, they always talk about a state of flow when the sport tends to slow down for them. And so I really try to help my leaders slow down the pace of work. So I try to incorporate some mindfulness and even meditation into their practice. I have something that I joke with them. I call it grabbing a PBR, which does not stand for Pabst Blue Ribbon, but really just pause, breathe, and reflect. just a little bit of a breathing technique that's as simple as like a 1-1-1-0 type of pattern, where they can just hit the pause button, connect with their breath, reflect or relax, so they can slow their game down. Um, so with that, we create some space. Then we can think about alternatives to the story that's in our head. So when we have imposter syndrome, right, we don't think we're enough. Shame comes into play, but we have so many great stories where we've been able to overcome, where we've shown our greatness. And so when that powerful inner critic narrative is there, it doesn't leave any space for some of the great things that we've done in our lives. So just slowing down and pausing gives them a chance to say, hey, let me recruit something from my past that could be really beneficial right now. And we work on that. So we're all going to have moments where we're triggered. What I try to do with my executives and my leaders is shorten how much time they're triggered. So a tough moment doesn't become a tough day or a tough weekend or a tough week. It's just that moment. And then we move on to the stuff that really sort of lives up to their potential.
Awesome. Awesome. So A, breathing exercises are really helpful, B, meditation, and then recruiting those past experience of success to uh, to really kind of mute the voice of the inner critic is what you're saying.
Yeah, or just have it. I tend to, when I talk to, in fact, I had a client last night, I chatted with her about, because she's got an interview coming up, and she's like, yeah, I got a little imposter syndrome present. And so instead of trying to restrict or resist or push down that voice, I try to create some space for it. Say, hey, you know what? If the negative self narrative is present, I can force it down. But usually, when we try to force something, it pushes back on us.
Right.
So I just say, hey, create some space, let it sit there. They can come to the interview. They don't have a role. They're there to watch, and in that way, we're not putting energy towards pushing it down, but rather we can use that energy, burn those calories on recruiting the great things that we want to share. If it happens to be a job interview in her case, or a presentation, or just a major decision we want to make.
Right, right. And I think also that, there's ways to reframe that imposter syndrome as like, this is a great opportunity because you don't feel 100% like you know everything. So this is the opportunity for you to be in a place where you get to learn new things and really, really grow yourself. So it's also a signal that this is a good challenge.
Oh, absolutely. So I love that you said that, Ben, because yeah, the reframing, it goes back to everything in our lives are neutral until we label them. So, we got, maybe we have to do a big speech or, a big pitch or what have you, and we feel the nerves. So I also love to ask my leaders, like, where do you feel your stress? Because if we can get better awareness on where we feel our stress, that's a great leading indicator, or canary in the coal mine, if you will, that we have stress on board. Gives us a chance to PBR it. But now we get to like reframe it. So anytime I'm feeling really nervous about something, I can get, yeah, just like anybody else, I can get all worked up and wrapped around the axle, being like, oh my God, I'm nervous. I can't, get attached to the outcome, all that jazz. But instead, I relabel it as like, hey, I'm pretty pumped. Like, this must be really important. And this is a great opportunity. So instead of saying, hey, I'm anxious, I try to reframe it in terms of, hey, I'm excited. And just that shift, that slight shift in perspective has, at least for me and for a lot of my clients, has made a big difference in a lot of our events.
Awesome. Yeah, no, it's like it lights up that same system of like fight or flight. So you're like more aware and yeah, you get to interpret that feeling state in a way that serves you versus in a way that could sabotage you.
Absolutely.
What haven't we touched on that you think is important for people who are on this journey to live more purpose-led lives?
Well, I think there's two things, and they're somewhat related, and it's about acceptance and forgiveness. And the early part of my recovery, it was a pretty dark spot for me. Actually, it wasn't pretty, it was dark. I was angry, bitter. I wanted revenge against the driver because he had a revoked license. five DUIs on his record, and I thought the whole thing was it just sucked. Life was unfair. When people were visiting me, I tried to put on the good front and try to be optimistic. But when the hospital got dark, I would argue with reality, and I wasn't very accepting of like what was right in front of me. And all that energy that I was using towards fighting reality wasn't helping me get better. And I see that happening with in all walks of life, where we just, you know, being accepting of the situation doesn't mean that we're totally stoked by it. I'm not saying we have to be happy, but we just have to accept it is for what it is. So now we can move on, so we can exercise choice. But we tend to, you know, carry that backpack of emotion with us into every interaction, every meeting at work, or, on a personal front. We should just carry it around with us, and we can be on message, right? We can be saying all the right things,
Right.
but we don't let go of the backpack. And in some ways, the backpack is there to protect us. So it goes back to that self narrative, but it's not helping us. So by accepting what is true, and for me, I had to get to a point where I accepted that, hey, this happened to me, that this was horrific. And yes, I can feel sad, and I can feel angry, and I can have some bitterness, but too much of that for too long isn't going to help me, become the person I want to become. It wasn't going to help me recover. So I think a big thing that people can weave into their personal lives and their corporate lives or entrepreneurial lives is the act of acceptance. Instead of arguing with reality, accept what is. So that gives us then a platform to make choice. The other piece, though, is forgiveness,
I
which,
think I want to
yeah,
get back to forgiveness, but when you were talking about that, what came up for me is, in a way that maybe a lot of people can identify with what you're saying, is maybe they haven't had an accident, but I know people, including myself, have carried emotional baggage from growing up, especially with like parental stuff, and we all experience trauma in some form or another growing up, and it can be something that, like you said earlier, we try and like push down and ignore. But if we are able to accept it and work through it and kind of neutralize it instead of fight it, it allows us to free up some of that space that we had from fighting it down. So in a way, to kind of bring that illustration to people that can identify with, oh, this happened to me when I was younger, and it still kind of owns them now.
absolutely. So in my book, I share 20 ways of being, and the first two are awareness, right, and then acceptance. Because whether it's like current day or, to your point, Ben, back in our youth, we're bringing that luggage, and after a while, we just add to it if we can't let it go. And I see that getting in the way of so many people truly living up to their full potential, their best version of themselves, or mastery. There's a lot of ways to, sort of say it. All sort of comes to the same type of journey, maybe same type of destination. But when we have all that stuff in that backpack of ours, there's no way we can truly step into our full selves.
So that's probably a nice segue as forgiveness, unpacking some of that backpack.
Yeah, so the forgiveness piece, and this is a powerful lesson I learned, several years into my recovery. So I was able over time to forgive the driver, but if I was really honest, if you came to me like 5 years in, or even 10 years in, I would say, well, like, I've forgiven the driver 80% of the way, right? So I still had 20% of the rocks in my backpack where I was like, that driver, and it would pop up every now and again, when I was feeling sorry for myself, because like I've mentioned before, my pathway back to health hasn't been linear. I've had some ups and downs. So every time I had a down, every time I had to go in for another surgery, or I had a complication, I'd go back to that driver, be like, that driver, he did it to me. It was all this external orientation as opposed to looking within myself. And then we took a family vacation to Europe. We went to Paris, and then we went out to Normandy and Omaha Beach and did that, and then we flew to Warsaw, or to Krakow, and we had a private tour of Auschwitz-Birkenau by a woman named Eva Kor. She lives in Terre Haute, Indiana. She's a surviving twin of the Holocaust.
Wow.
Her whole family was murdered in the concentration camps, but her and her sister, and if you know anything, you know, as we know about World War II and the Holocaust, twins got special treatment. And she drove us around in her golf cart. She was about 89, I think, at the time, and she had so much energy. She had the energy of a 29-year-old, and she was just driving us around and, you know, landmarking where things happened. And the whole event was so profound, you know, to go there, and it you know, had the environment of death, and, you know, even though she had all this life in her. And at the end of the tour, you know, it was middle of July, there was no shade, the sun was beating down, we were all sweating, and someone asked her, well, Eva, what do you think, you know, what's your feeling, you know, towards the Germans, towards the Nazis? And I thought she would, you know, say something like, you know, well, you know, I can't stand them, or something, you know, to that effect. And she shared with the audience, she said, well, I've forgiven them. And then I perked up, and I was like, huh? I was like, I'm like, now I got interested in her answer. And she's like, I've forgiven them because I deserve forgiveness. They don't necessarily deserve my forgiveness, but I do. And I knew if I carried around all my animosity towards the Germans, towards the Nazis, who did this to not only my family, but to all Jews, then I wouldn't live the life I wanted to live. So I forgave them because I deserve forgiveness. And in that moment, I was like, wow, she can do that. Like, I can certainly let go of the 20% that I have towards the driver. And so the tour ended. We walked back to the train, and on the train ride home, I worked on just letting go of that extra baggage I had against the driver. And it was, you know, it was lightning, right? So it was just like, I was just, it was, you know, freeing to like give that up, right? When you
Yeah.
have acceptance and forgiveness in your life, you can use more of your energy towards doing the things that you want to do in the world.
Right. I love it. I love it. And I'm just wondering, you know, who out there in the audience listening to this has some forgiveness they could extend to people in their lives that would free them up to live more purposefully, and just to kind of meditate and think on that, because it is so powerful. You know, I know for me it was just like, oh, this combination of like having great parents and being angry at them for XYZ that made me ABC, and being able to like let that go, being like, they did the best they could with what they had, and now it's up to me to do the best I can with what I have, and everything else is just a story that doesn't serve me.
Absolutely. And hey, it took my accident for me to experience that. You know, I didn't have the type of enlightenment or awareness earlier in my life. I didn't grow up that way. You know, so I'm I'm very grateful for my last bad day. It helped me turn, you know, turn my life, you know, and my life wasn't like, hey, down by the river in a trailer, right? So type of life, right? It wasn't that. When you looked at me back then, you know, I had a good career. My girls were really young, 3.5 and 7 months old, good marriage. So, but there were things that were misaligned, and because I was trying to, you know, shove and control all the stress, I was just pouring it inside. So the accident for me really was a big aha, big pause button to say, hey, how do you want to go forward? How do you want to live your life with more intention, and let go of the stuff that needs to be like let go, so you can sort of step into whatever version of yourself that you want to be.
Awesome, awesome. I think that's a great place to land the plane. Where or park the bike. I don't know. I don't know a good
Yeah, we can
place.
park the bike or land the plane. We can do a little bit of both, you know. So
Awesome, awesome. Where can people find out more about you and your work?
Well, the best place, Ben, is to go to my website, which is michaelobrienshift.com. And there they can learn about my book, which gives all its proceeds away to charity. So when they read it, hopefully they get a pearl or two to help them live a better life and lead their career a little bit differently. But they give the gift of mobility because all the proceeds go to World Bicycle Relief. So they can check the book out there and through Amazon, and then all the social media channels are there too. So if you want to connect there, we can connect there.
Sweet. All right. Well, Michael, really appreciate your time, your wisdom, and sharing with us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Ben, and hopefully your listeners got a pearl or two.
I'm sure they did. I'm sure they did. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Purpose Up with me, Ben Stein. Please subscribe here on YouTube so you can be updated on when the latest episodes come out, as well on Apple, Spotify, or wherever else you consume podcasts. And since you're still sticking around, I've got a special free gift for you. Just go to purposeup.com/free gift or click this link here to get book recommendations from me, a guided meditation, as well as a book I wrote on how to live your life more purposefully. Thank you so much for spending time with me. I really appreciate it and you.